Here is a short excerpt from Stephen King's On Writing, and it's a section where he's talking about grammar. Take any noun, put it with any verb, and you have a sentence. It never fails. Rocks explode. Jane transmits. Mountains float. These are all perfect sentences. Many such thoughts make little rational sense, but even the stranger ones, like plums deify, have a kind of poetic weight that's nice. The simplicity of noun-verb construction is useful. At the very least, it can provide a safety net for your writing. Strunk and White caution against too many simple sentences in a row, but simple sentences provide a path you can follow when you fear getting lost in the tangles of rhetoric. All those restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, those modifying phrases, those appositives and compound complex sentences, if you start to freak out at the sight of such unmapped territory, unmapped by you at least, just remind yourself that rocks explode, Jane transmits, mountains float, and plums deify. Grammar is not just a pain in the ass, it's the pole you grab to get your thoughts up on their feet and walking. Besides, all those simple sentences worked for Hemingway, didn't they? Even when he was drunk on his ass, he was a fucking genius. I read that this morning from Stephen King, and I liked it. And I liked it because it reminded me that writing is simple. It's so easy to get carried away when you're writing and plotting and outlining and trying to come up with a great plan and devise a great system. And really when you get lost in the maze of your own cleverness. I guess I'm talking about two different things. I'm talking about the act of writing, which is just, in the simplest terms, the act of putting sentences down on a page. But then I'm also extrapolating that out and talking about the act of finishing a novel, which is quote-unquote a grand story or a full story, a full-size novel. And those two things, putting sentences down on a page and then writing a novel, obviously are very closely related, but they're not exactly the same thing, because you can write a short story or a journal or a diary, and none of those things are a novel. And you can also compose a great story without putting sentences down on paper. So you could just talk and tell a full-length story like an old-time storyteller. You could tell the story of Odysseus, or the story of Beowulf, or the story of the fox and the coyote and how the sun and the moon were formed. And you can also tell a grand story in a song, and you could also tell a grand story in a play in the theater. So when Stephen King is talking about grammar and saying to remember that it's simple and take any noun and place it with any verb and you have a sentence, he's not exactly talking about writing novels, but he is also talking about writing novels, and I'm making that comparison myself because I'm writing a novel right now. But on both levels, it's kind of refreshing, I guess, to read that, because it's refreshing to hear that it's simple, both the act of writing and then the act of creating a novel. And it's good inspiration, and it's a good reminder to anyone, but especially to first-time writers and early writers who, when I think of bad writing, I often think of insecurity, I guess. I think of someone who doesn't really know what they're saying, so they're kind of dancing around or quote-unquote beating around the bush or saying all these things. You know, when you're talking to someone and you're like, just get to the fucking point. Like, what are you trying to say? And that's what I think about when I think about bad writing, as someone who's saying a lot of words, but not exactly getting to the point or telling us what the true story is. You know, it's like sometimes a craggy mountain, when placed delicately atop the clear blue surface of the clear blue sea. It's like, just fucking say mountains float. Mountains float. Stephen King, when he's talking about grammar, and he even says in his book that he doesn't like talking about grammar, or he debated whether or not to add a section of grammar in his book on writing, but he did talk about it. And mostly what I remember is he talked about how he hates adverbs and despises the use of all adverbs, which is funny to hear him sort of gripe about it in an old man cranky and griping style. But I have to believe that all writers need this advice from time to time, and especially new writers and young writers. But it's interesting to me, that connection between, insecurity and then confidence, I guess what I'm saying. That when you think about a teenager or an adult who is insecure and can't exactly spit out what they're trying to say, it's because they don't actually know what they're trying to say. And I think that's it's just such a good equal comparison to a writer who, if they don't really know what their story is about, then they're going to end up saying a lot of things and giving a lot of descriptions and even showcasing a lot of events that aren't necessarily vital to the story. And that's because they don't have a full confidence in what they're doing and full command over their craft. So I don't know. I've always thought about that and thought it was interesting, and just found it to be an interesting comparison, I guess, between someone who's insecure versus confident, and then a writer who is saying a lot of words but not exactly getting to the point. Mountains float. After I read that Stephen King excerpt, then I had to pick up, I was like, I couldn't remember if I had any Hemingway, because when we moved overseas, I sold a lot of my books, and I have a small and modest library now. But I did find one Hemingway collection I have, which is perfect. If you're going to have anything from Hemingway, then you might as well have a collection of short stories. So I hadn't thought about Hemingway in a long time, or read him in a long time, and I'm no Hemingway expert, but I do enjoy reading him. And when I read that Stephen King quote, then I had to just pick up this novel and just read. I'm just going to read just a couple excerpts from just the beginnings of a couple stories, because if you listen to this podcast, then you know that I geek out at the beginning of stories. I love to just start a story and hear, and maybe I do that so much these days because I've been working on the start of my story, but I don't think so, because I think I've always done this and always nerded out on it. But I love to read the beginning of a story because it's so, well, I won't go into all that right now. But this one is called Up in Michigan. And it's interesting just to go back and look at Hemingway once in a while, because exactly like Stephen King said, it's just so refreshing how simple and concrete and rock hard his language is. So listen to this one. This is the beginning of a story called Up in Michigan, and he just wastes no time. It's like there's 3 paragraphs in the beginning. So the first paragraph is he describes a man. In the second paragraph, he describes a girl. And the third paragraph, he describes how the girl likes the man. And it's so great because he doesn't waste a long time describing how beautiful the girl is or how handsome the man is, or doesn't even give any dialogue at first. He just sort of sums it all up really quickly, and then, and then we can get to the point, which is the story is going to be about an interaction that these two people have. So this is just a great example of someone, a master of the craft who knows what story he wants to tell. So he knows he's going to tell the story of this interaction, which is a affair between this guy and this young girl. So when he starts off the story, he's going to just give us a quick description. Here's all the things about who the guy is. Here's who the girl is. Anyway, I'll go ahead and just read the very beginning. Okay, here goes. Up in Michigan. Jim Gilmore came to Horton's Bay from Canada. He bought the blacksmith shop from an old man Horton. Jim was short and dark with big mustaches and big hands. He was a good horseshoer and did not look much like a blacksmith, even with his leather apron on. He lived upstairs above the blacksmith shop and took his meals at DJ Smith's. All right, that's the first paragraph. It's done. We don't have any flowery language or descriptions or whatever. We just learn everything about Jim, all the facts. Now here's the second paragraph. Liz Coates worked for Smith's. Miss Smith, who was a very large, clean woman, said Liz Coates was the neatest girl she'd ever seen. Liz had good legs and always wore clean gingham aprons, and Jim noticed that her hair was always neat behind. He liked her face because it was so jolly, but he never thought about her. Okay, so the second paragraph describes the girl, and it even starts to get into the fact that Jim likes the girl, but he doesn't think about her very much. So already in the second paragraph, we're getting into their relationship, which is the point of the story, and we're already there. And here's the third paragraph. Liz liked Jim very much. She liked it the way he walked over from the shop and often went to the kitchen door to watch for him to start down the road. She liked it about his mustache. She liked it about how white his teeth were when he smiled. She liked it very much that he didn't look like a blacksmith. She liked it how much DJ Smith and Miss Smith liked Jim. One day she found that she liked it the way the hair was black on his arms and how white they were above the tanned line when he washed up in the wash basin outside the house. Liking that made her feel funny. Oh, it's just so refreshing how clear that is. Man, if you just pick up a fiction, if you just go to Barnes and Noble or whatever the hell bookshop is closest to you, and you're browsing around and you pick a fiction book up off the shelf, a sci-fi story or a fantasy story or a romance, whatever, it's like how many licks to the center of the Tootsie Pop? How many paragraphs is it going to take you to figure out what the story is actually about? You look at the cover of your story and you maybe read the brief description, and that's the packaging, that's the gift wrapping that is supposed to tell you what the story is about from a quick glance. That's the whole purpose of genre, and the whole purpose of the book cover is not to, self-publishing authors talk about this a lot. The whole point of the book cover is not to create some great work of art or do something magical or different. It's not to stand out. The point of a book cover is to fit in. It's to give the reader an expectation so that they can have that expectation met. So the worst thing you could do with a book cover is to write a romance story and then have it look like some other kind of story, because then you're guaranteeing that the reader is not going to have their expectation met, which means the reader's not going to be happy. Anyways, when you pick up a book off the shelf, my point is that you're already already kind of know what the story is about when you pick it up. Why? Well, because you're in the fantasy section, or if you're browsing on Amazon, shopping online, then you're already in the you've already clicked. If you're like me, then you've already clicked fantasy from the start, and you're scrolling through fantasy books. Or even if you didn't do that, maybe you're getting recommended from another book that it's similar to. Anyways, the point is that before you even read the book, you have a lot of filtering going on. You're already sort of going through this funnel of, at the top of the funnel is all the books in the world and all the possibilities in the world. And at the bottom of the funnel is this book. And so before you even read the first sentence, you're already, progressing, going further down that funnel, or further up the pyramid. I'm sure I could have used a better analogy there than a funnel, but it is what it is. Happy Wednesday, everybody. And when you pick up that book off the shelf, you already have some idea, but you don't know exactly what the story is about. Maybe you don't know what the heart of the story is. Maybe the book description was clever. Maybe the cover was a perfect fit for the genre, but there's still a lot of possibilities out there of what this book could be. And then you start reading, and man, it's so common. It's so it happens so much where you read and you're like, and you just think, what is this story actually about? And even good books, even good storytellers, or even someone who's sold a lot of fiction, it might take them a while to get to the point, or you might have to, this is really annoying. If you've ever read fantasy, you might read some long prologue, and even though the prologue's interesting, the whole time you're just thinking, when are we going to get to, even George Martin put prologues in Game of Thrones, and even though it's a great scene and I think the prologue of Game of Thrones is no, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Anyways, my point is that even in a good story, it might take you a few pages to get to the point, or to realize who your main character is, or to get past the description or whatever, and then figure out what the story is about. And that's also something that's beautiful about the short story form. So this Hemingway story, Up in Michigan, it's not a novel. It's I'm looking at it right now, and in a paperback form, it's like 6 pages long. So that's something great. That's why it's good for young writers. And when I say young, I mean new writers, to practice writing short stories, because you don't have a lot of time to get lost. You don't have room for any of that fluff, and it helps focus your efforts. And that's what I did. I took Ray Bradbury's advice when I first started writing, and I tried writing a short story every week, and they all sucked, and some were more fun than others, but what they all did was help me practice on focusing and getting to the point. That's the moral of this podcast. Get to the point. So amazing to look at this Hemingway story. So fun to read this. So interesting to see how he does it. This is not really a romance. It's not a romance story because there's not a happy ending. It's a short story, which is basically a few scenes tied together of a very intense time in these two characters' life and an intense event that happens. But it's just so clean and so refreshing and so lovely, and it's a great reminder for me as I'm writing my novel right now to remember what you're getting at and exactly what you're going for. And I think Kurt Vonnegut has a quote like that. I'm not going to stop and look it up, but the idea of what Kurt Vonnegut said was, don't hold anything back. as writers also get caught, or at least I do. I get caught up in this game of like, oh, you want to do, I want to foreshadow things and give mysteries, and obviously you want to surprise the reader, so you want to drop hints, and sometimes that's another example of getting too clever for your own good. It's like you're trying to save the best for last, and you're trying to have these great reveals, and Kurt Vonnegut's advice was just to say everything, reveal everything, say the most pressing thing right now. And the idea behind that is like, I think goes back to this conciseness, this clarity of a writer like Hemingway, who just tells you what he's talking about. He could have started the story with this girl Liz. Maybe you have this scene where Liz is working in the bar and shining the bar and cleaning the tables, and then Jim walks in, and then they have this conversation, and could have done all that, but it would have taken longer to get to the point of the story. And so that's why I love this one. Before I move on, let me just read the start of another story. I wanted to do two. Here's another one. This one is actually only 3 pages. It's very short. It's called Old Man at the Bridge. And I'm not going to break down this story as much because I actually don't remember this one. But I'm just going to read the first paragraph because the language is so good. Old Man at the Bridge. An old man with steel-rimmed spectacles and very dusty clothes sat by the side of the road. There was a pontoon bridge across the river, and carts, trucks, and men, women, and children were crossing it. The mule-drawn carts staggered up the steep bank from the bridge, with soldiers helping push against the spokes of the wheels. The trucks ground up and away, heading out of it all, and the peasants plodded along in the ankle-deep dust. But the old man sat there without moving. He was too tired to go any farther. A lot of times I get carried away, and bad writers get carried away with descriptions. Whenever you introduce a new character, you start thinking about what their nose looks like and what their eye color is. And Hemingway here, he introduces this old man, and he says, an old man with steel-rimmed spectacles and very dusty clothes sat by the side of the road. So that's pretty good. That's obviously he could go into more detail, and I think throughout the next pages he'll pepper some more detail in about the old man, but that's good enough to start. It gives us just enough of a description so that we can picture the old man. He has steel-rimmed spectacles, and he has very dusty clothes, and he's an old man. So that's enough. There's this idea in writing where you want to give the reader enough, but not too much, because the imagination is so good at filling these things in. And it's always sad for me when I read a novel and then I watch I always feel kind of pretentious or like a writerly asshole when I talk about this, but it's really true. I really feel sad when I read a novel and I love it, and then I'm going to watch the movie. Like, this was I deliberated about this for a long time with Lord of the Rings, and then also with Game of Thrones, because you read these stories and your imagination has filled in all the details, so you have a picture in your head of what the characters look like. That's this strange and very unique blend of, first of all, what the author supplied you with, the descriptions the author gave you, and then how you filled that in. It's almost like the author gives you a sketch or a pencil drawing of these characters and tells you they have blue eyes, or they're tall, or they have a mustache or they always wear a red sweater. And then, but obviously they can't, it would be impossible for the author, even if they wanted to describe every detail of how the character looks, because even someone who gets carried away or has excessive detail or gives excessive description about a character, even they're not going to have time or have the patience to get down to every last detail of what color their socks are and the width of their fingernails and what their breath smells like. So no matter what, there's this fun act of interplay going on between, the sketch that the author provides and the coloring that the reader adds to the character. So I just know, like when I watched Game of Thrones, I remember I was just really disappointed when I saw Ned Stark. It wasn't how I pictured him. See, now I can't even remember, and that's why I'm sad, because it's a forever thing. It never can go back to the way it was, because once you watch the film, then you're all like, Frodo is always gonna look like fucking, what's his name, Elijah Wood. Frodo is always gonna be Elijah Wood in my mind. I'm never gonna remember the real Frodo, the true the true Frodo, the Frodo or the Bilbo that I invented in my head when I was a kid. I'm never gonna have that Bilbo back. It seems even more silly and ridiculous to posit this argument when I'm using Hobbit names, but I really am sad every time I do that, and it sucks. And I actually, I read all the Game of Thrones books, and I was way behind. Like, it was like season 5 or maybe even 6 of the TV show, and I hadn't watched any of them yet. And I was purposefully being stubborn about it because I love the book so much, and especially in the Game of Thrones universe, the characters are so rich, and I just knew, I put it off for a long time just because I knew that all those characters, the way I saw them in my head, they were just going to die. They were just going to disappear and get replaced by these upgraded versions of Hollywood actors. And eventually I gave in, and I'm glad I did, because the TV show was amazing, and I wanted to have that experience, and I did. But I'll never remember what, like, Bran, I don't know. I won't go into it. But back to Hemingway. An old man with steel-rimmed spectacles and very dusty clothes sat by the side of the road. It's perfect. It's everything that we need. I can do the rest. I can fill in the rest. And the second sentence, so that's one sentence. So already we know who our protagonist is. We know what he's doing. He's sitting by the side of the road. And we know what he looks like. And we know a little bit about his situation and his station in life, because he has very dusty clothes. So he's either a traveler, or he's poor, or he's working. But he has steel-rimmed spectacles, so he's probably not digging ditches. Anyways, the point is that we have a lot of information about who our protagonist is in one simple sentence, no flowery language, no excessive details, and then we can learn more about the scene. So Hemingway is setting the scene: pontoon bridge, carts, trucks, soldiers, passers-by, things happening, peasants plodding along. And so it's interesting because you have this paragraph, and it's bookended by 2 sentences about the old man, and then in the middle you have this description of the scene. So that's interesting. I'm just looking at it now. You have the first paragraph is your introduction. It starts off with a sentence of the old man. Then you have 3 or 4 sentences of what the scene looks like. And then the last sentence of the paragraph is, but the old man sat there without moving. He was too tired to go any farther. Oh, that's 2 sentences. So now we know the old man is tired and he's still sitting there. And then we have a twist. The second paragraph is, it was my business to cross the bridge, explore the bridgehead beyond. So I was wrong. The old man is not the protagonist. The old man is the main character, but this story is told in the first person. And I didn't expect that because the story before was not told in the first person. So this is the story of the protagonist is actually the writer who's telling the story, and then he meets the old man. So I don't think I'll spend any more time talking about why Hemingway is great. There's I'm sure decades and decades of literary pundits who have broken down Hemingway, and decades and decades and decades of graduate students who have written doctorates on Hemingway's style and Hemingway's life and Hemingway's misogyny and Hemingway's craft, whatever. But I love it. I love his stories. I love how concise they are. I love how just crystal clear they are and how cutting they are. And when I read that Stephen King quote about mountains float, plums deify, now I forget the other 2, Jane transmits, made me want to pick up Hemingway. And it's a good reminder for me and a good reminder for all writers. And I think a good reminder for all people everywhere for in your communications to remember to get to the point, because that's a pet peeve of mine when people ramble or tell stories that aren't going anywhere. Okay, so I think this is going to be a relatively short episode today because I have to get going soon, but I wanted to give an update on Tomorrow City because I am still excited that the first drafting has begun. I'm pretty sure I talked about this last week because I had just started. So now I've been first drafting for just over a week, and I have, let me check. I have 2,084 words written, which is certainly nothing to brag about. Some authors I know will write 5,000 words in a day. I know that I can write a few thousand words in a day when I'm really rolling, but right now I'm not rolling, and I'm just going to be honest about that because I hadn't been writing for a long time, and now I'm getting back into it. So it's just like working out or running or something. You gotta ease into it, not because I want to ease into it, but because I just can't jump in at a marathon pace. So I'm trying not to be worried about that, but I'm also trying to celebrate the fact that now I'm putting words down on the page. And the most important thing, and the only important thing, and the thing that I'm most encouraged about is just the fact that I'm writing. For right now, I'm doing from 7 to 8 every morning, and that's the non-negotiable time that I've given myself. And a couple mornings I kind of suffered through that hour and just wrote a few words or nothing, and then a few other mornings I felt good and I wrote 500 or 1,000 words, and that's how I got to where I am today. So it's going. I'm almost finished with, I guess you could say, the beginning chapter, where my protagonist is at the airport and he has arrived to Tomorrow City. So maybe this will be a good test. I'll read the first. Yeah, why not? I'll just go ahead this will be, that's the whole point of this podcast, right? Is it's sort of a record about what I've worked on and the progress that I'm making. So maybe it'll be interesting one day to look back and see what I did. So, why not? I'll brush aside my insecurities, brush aside the fact that this is first draft stuff and it's obviously going to change a lot from every draft. It's going to change with the editing process every time, and then obviously the final draft will be very different. Maybe even the final draft won't even have these words, or the first chapter will be totally different. But that's enough qualifying. I can tell I'm qualifying because I'm nervous. But what I want to do is actually share what I wrote. So this is the beginning of Tomorrow City, and it'll change a lot, but I'm excited about it. It's fun. Feels good to be putting words on the page. It feels good to be first drafting again, and it feels good to be bringing my story to life. So this is kind of a fun, interesting test. I just talked all about concise grammar and about Hemingway, and about how when you first start a story, how many paragraphs does it take to get to the point. So that's something that's been on my mind a lot, and that's something that I tried to do in this beginning of my story. So you can judge for yourself whether I did that or not. So let me read the first, first 400 words, 389 words of Tomorrow City. After that, I'm going to go ahead. I don't know. I feel strange talking about my work, or if I comment on it like I already have been, I feel like I'm just making apologies or being nervous or dancing around whatever it is I'm trying to say. So I'm just going to read it. I'm going to let it be, let it live there, and then I'm going to go on, and I will keep working on the first drafting this week and be back with more updates next week. And it's been fun. I enjoyed this episode talking about Hemingway. I didn't expect that I would pick up Hemingway this morning, but it was fun to look at his stories. Good inspiration. I'm actually really excited to write now, which is a good thing about this podcast, is it makes me, if I'm kind of in a lull like I was yesterday where I wasn't excited about writing, then this podcast is really good at refocusing me. So I'm going to actually get back to the real work of writing after this, and I'm going to leave you and come back next Wednesday. So thanks so much for listening. I will finish now with this first 389 words of the very first draft of the first story of Tomorrow City. Here we go. What do I remember about landing at the Incheon airport? My first time in Korea, first time in Asia, the first time I ever left the States. I could lie and say that if I close my eyes and clench my teeth, I can still recall the view out my little plastic window as my plane descended from the clouds. The fishing boats, the vast gray seas, the mud flats that surround the airport island. I could say that I'll never forget the warm-eyed smile of the stewardess at the cockpit door as she motioned me down the steel stairway saying, "Welcome to Korea." Or the sharp chill of the springtime air that filled my lungs as I made my way across the tarmac towards the terminal, along with all the other passengers who had just endured the 12-hour flight from San Francisco. It wouldn't be a total lie. I do remember some of those details, but the truth is that when I think back on that time, mostly what I remember is a feeling. I remember feeling excited. Even now that I'm older, a lot more savvy and a lot more cynical, even now I can feel it buzzing through me, reminding me just a little bit what it felt like to be young and to be on the first few steps of an adventure. So I remember that feeling, And I also remember the people that I met those first few days in Tomorrow City. For this is a story, above all, a story about memories too sad to look at, a story about songs too beautiful to sing, wonders too strange to be true, and most of all, about a city unlike any other city in the world. And since the beating heart of any story is its characters, I suppose that I should start there. And then that's like a scene break, and then the first scene will start. The first character that I met in Tomorrow City was Miss Shin. She was either too busy or too brusque to introduce herself, but I saw that she had a square plastic name tag pinned to the label of pinned to the lapel of her black suit. She came straight up to me while I was waiting in the visa line to get my passport stamped upon arrival. I saw her from a distance, but I never guessed that she was coming for me until we were standing face to face.